When Halloween slashed its way into theaters in 1978, it changed horror movies forever. Made for almost nothing and shot in just 20 days, this indie film became one of the most profitable movies ever made. Here are 20 weird and surprising facts about Halloween. Fact 1. The most iconic mask in horror history was purchased from a Hollywood Boulevard costume shop for just $1.98. Production designer Tommy Lee Wallace was given the assignment, go find a mask, on an extremely tight budget. He went to a local magic shop and bought 2 cheap masks. One was a clown mask, and the other was a Captain Kirk mask from Star Trek. The Kirk mask looked nothing like William Shatner after Wallace modified it. He used scissors to widen the eye holes, shaved off the sideburns and eyebrows, spray painted the face bluish white, and teased out the hair. When the mask came out of the dressing room, John Carpenter said it created a shiver through the room, and everyone knew they had something special. The mask's unsettling quality came from its origin as a mold of William Shatner's face originally made for Star Trek makeup effects. The neutral human features, once painted and distorted, created an uncanny valley effect that was simultaneously familiar and alien. Shatner didn't learn his likeness terrorized audiences until years after the film's release. When he found out, he thought people were joking and couldn't believe it was true. He later said he felt honored by the association, though he received no royalties from the franchise. Fact 2. Halloween was made for an incredibly small budget of $300,000 to $325,000 and filmed in just 20 days during May 1978. For comparison, other films of that era like Carrie had a budget of $1.8 million. The entire production was described as basically a bunch of film students making a movie. Most of the crew were students or amateur filmmakers who heard about the production by word of mouth. Many worked 12 to 14-hour days for minimal or no pay just for the experience. Even star Jamie Lee Curtis helped move camera equipment between setups. The actors wore their own clothes since there was no money for a costume department. Curtis's entire wardrobe was purchased at JCPenney for approximately $100. The production worked out of cinematographer Dean Cundy's Winnebago. When they needed kids walking down the street, anyone who had a family rounded up their children. The caterer's truck was featured as the Phelps Auto Service truck in one shot, while Carpenter's old Cadillac showed up in another scene. Despite the tiny budget, the film went on to gross $70 million worldwide, making it one of the most successful independent films of all time. That's a 233 times return on investment, completely changing Hollywood's perception of horror and independent cinema. Fact 3. Halloween was filmed in May 1978 in sunny South Pasadena, California, but it's set on Halloween night in Illinois. This created a huge problem because California in spring looks nothing like Illinois in fall. The trees were green and lush instead of autumnal. There were no dead leaves on the ground. The crew's solution was to purchase bags of artificial leaves from craft stores and spray paint them orange, red, and brown. Production designer Tommy Lee Wallace personally painted many of these fake leaves. Then they strategically scattered them throughout each scene to create the illusion of autumn. But here's the funny part. Between takes, cast members literally had to chase windblown leaves through the streets, collecting them in garbage bags so they could reuse them in the next scene. The same leaves appear in multiple different locations throughout the movie. Carpenter initially wanted to somehow change the trees too to make them look more autumnal, but budget restraints prevented it. If you watch carefully, you can see palm trees visible in some backgrounds, and all the vegetation is lush and green. The warm, sunny weather looks nothing like Illinois autumn. Despite these imperfections, the artificial leaves became a charming element of the film's cult appeal. Fact 4. Of the $300,000 budget, approximately $70,000 was spent on professional Panavision camera equipment. That's nearly 25% of the entire budget spent on just cameras. John Carpenter insisted on using high-quality professional cameras because he believed they would trick audiences into thinking this was a high-budget production. His logic was that if the film looked professionally made with the right cinematic aspect ratio, audiences would overlook the low-budget sets, costumes, and unknown actors. The gamble paid off spectacularly. Halloween was the second production ever to use the brand new Panaglide Steadicam system alongside Terrence Malick's Days of Heaven. The revolutionary camera allowed smooth, floating point-of-view shots that became signature elements of the film. The famous opening 4-minute tracking shot was incredibly difficult to film. It took 20 takes over 16 hours with the crew working through the night. They went through 3 different camera operators who couldn't be strapped into the heavy Steadicam rig for 1 more minute. Crew members had to play high-stakes indoor parkour to clear the shot, jumping out of windows to move lights, dangling off balconies, and hurling furniture out of the way. They only stopped filming when the sun started rising. That expensive camera equipment created the cinematic look that helped Halloween transcend its tiny budget. Fact 5. The role of Dr. Loomis was originally offered to horror legends Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee, Carpenter wanted a distinguished British actor for the part. Peter Cushing, fresh from playing Grand Moff Tarkin in Star Wars, was the first choice. But Cushing's agent rejected the offer because the salary was too low. They were offering around $20,000, which the agent felt was beneath Cushing's status. Next, they approached Christopher Lee, who was famous for playing Dracula in numerous Hammer horror films. Lee also turned down the role due to the low pay. Years later, Christopher Lee had a run-in with John Carpenter and told him directly that declining the role of Dr. Loomis was the biggest mistake he ever made in his career. Producer Irwin Yablans then suggested Donald Pleasance, a respected British character actor. Pleasance agreed to do the film because his daughter Lucy, who was a guitarist, had enjoyed the score from Carpenter's previous film Assault on Precinct 13. Pleasance was paid $20,000 for just 5 days of work and appears on screen for approximately 18 minutes. Despite his limited screen time, Pleasance's performance as the obsessed psychiatrist became legendary. His piercing eyes and methodical delivery created an unforgettable character. Fact 6. Nick Castle, who played Michael Myers in most scenes, was paid just $25 per day. That was barely minimum wage even in 1978. Castle wasn't a professional actor. He was John Carpenter's friend from film school who initially just came to the set to watch the movie being filmed. Carpenter thought Castle had the right build and walk to play Michael Myers, so he asked him to put on the costume. Castle's casting came through friendship rather than audition. Carpenter's direction for Castle was brilliantly simple: don't act. When Castle asked about Michael's motivation for scenes, Carpenter replied that his motivation was to walk from one marker to another and not act. The only specific instruction Carpenter gave was during the murder of Bob, when he told Castle to tilt his head and examine the corpse as if it were a butterfly collection. This head tilt became one of Michael Myers' signature moves. For the brief scene where Michael's face is revealed, they used actor Tony Moran instead because Carpenter wanted a more angelic face that would contrast with Michael's heinous acts. Moran was paid $250 for his appearance. Castle accepted that his face wasn't right for the reveal. After Halloween, Castle went on to become a successful director, making films like The Last Starfighter and Dennis the Menace. Fact 7. Because Halloween was shot completely out of sequence, Jamie Lee Curtis didn't know how scared her character should be in different scenes. To solve this problem, John Carpenter created a fear meter ranging from 1 to 10. Before filming each scene, Carpenter would tell Curtis something like, "Here's about a 7, here's about a 6, and the scene we're going to shoot tonight is about a 9.5. Curtis would then calibrate her performance accordingly, adjusting her facial expressions and scream volumes for each level on the meter. This system helped Curtis maintain consistency throughout her first major film role. Curtis was only 19 years old during filming and initially had reservations about the role. She felt she identified more with the outspoken characters like Linda rather than the quiet, repressed Laurie. After shooting her first few scenes, Curtis worried she'd given a bad performance and became convinced she would be fired. When her phone rang that night and it was John Carpenter calling, Curtis was certain it was the end of her movie career. Instead, Carpenter called to congratulate her and tell her he was very happy with the way things had gone. This reassurance helped Curtis relax and deliver the authentic, terrified performance that made her a star. Fact 8. After a test screening, a studio executive told John Carpenter that Halloween wasn't scary. This devastating feedback motivated Carpenter to save the film with music. Working against impossible deadlines, Carpenter composed and performed the entire score himself in just 3 days. The iconic Halloween theme, now one of cinema's most recognizable pieces of music, was written in approximately 1 hour. The theme was based on a simple piano exercise in 5/4 time signature that Carpenter's father had taught him on bongos when Carpenter was a child in 1961. Carpenter stated in interviews that he can play just about any keyboard, but he can't read or write music. The score was performed using synthesizers and credited to the Bowling Green Orchestra, which wasn't a real orchestra at all. It was just Carpenter and some musical friends. The minimalist, synthesizer-heavy soundtrack became as iconic as the film itself. The music creates tension and signals danger in a way that perfectly complements the visuals. After the executive watched the film again with the music, she immediately changed her mind and agreed the movie was terrifying. Carpenter's score proved that the right music could completely transform audience perception. The Halloween theme has been used and referenced in countless films and has become synonymous with horror itself. Fact 9. Producer Irwin Yablans needed $300,000 to make Halloween, but he didn't actually have the money or an interested investor. He began chasing after Mustafa Akkad, an experienced film investor, but Akkad was completely uninterested in the project. He was busy in Morocco shooting a lavish historical epic starring Rod Steiger that was costing $300,000 per day. Yes, per day. When Carpenter said his entire film would cost just $300,000 total, Akkad initially brushed him off. Yablans realized he needed to appeal to Akkad's pride. He told Akkad $300,000 would would probably be too much for you to invest, knowing Akkad couldn't back off because of his ego. The tactic worked perfectly. Outraged by the implication that he couldn't afford such a small project, Akkad immediately agreed to fund the entire film on the spot just to prove he could. This pride-based psychology saved the entire production. Despite having little interest in the project initially, Akkad ended up facilitating every Halloween sequel until his death in 2005, becoming known as the godfather of Halloween. The film's massive success meant Akkad made millions from his impulsive decision. It's ironic that one of horror's most influential franchises only exists because a producer got his pride wounded. Fact 10. The famous 4-minute opening tracking shot that shows young Michael Myers murdering his sister is one of the most technically impressive sequences in the film. John Carpenter scheduled this massive shot to be filmed in a single night, which turned into a production nightmare. The free movement of the panelized camera meant every inch of the set was fair game, so the crew had to play high-stakes indoor parkour to stay out of frame. Assistant director Krishna Rao recalled crew members jumping out of windows to move their lights, dangling off balconies, and hurling couches out of the way. They shot 20 different takes over 16 hours straight. The production went through 3 different camera operators because the heavy Steadicam rig was so exhausting to wear. Each operator could only handle being strapped into the equipment for so long before they needed to be replaced. The crew worked with rabid determination, giving their all to be part of movie history. They only stopped filming because the sun started rising and they couldn't shoot anymore. First assistant director Rick Wallace said in a 2021 interview, "I'm convinced that if it were still night, we'd still be shooting." The final opening shot became one of cinema's most famous sequences and helped establish the film's unsettling point of view style. Fact 11. John Carpenter cast Jamie Lee Curtis in Halloween as the ultimate tribute to Alfred Hitchcock. Curtis is the daughter of Janet Leigh, who played Marion Crane in Hitchcock's Psycho and was famously killed in the iconic shower scene. By casting Lee's daughter in his horror film, Carpenter was paying homage to the master of suspense. Producer Deborah Hill recognized the publicity potential immediately, saying, "I knew casting Jamie Lee would be great publicity for the film because her mother was in Psycho." The horror lineage proved irresistible. Curtis earned $8,000 for her work, which was respectable for an unknown actress, but modest compared to horror standards today. Curtis wasn't actually Carpenter's first choice for Laurie. He originally wanted Anne Lockhart, the daughter of June Lockhart from Lassie, but Lockhart had commitments to other projects. Carpenter later admitted he had no idea who Jamie Lee Curtis was and didn't even watch TV. Curtis auditioned 3 times before landing the role. At the time of filming, Curtis was starring in a TV show called Operation Petticoat. Of all the female leads who were supposed to be playing high school students, Curtis was the only one who was actually a teenager during filming. Her natural charm and authenticity transcended the script and helped create the final girl archetype. Fact 12. The ruined Myers house you see in the movie wasn't a set. It was a real abandoned house owned by a church, and it looked exactly that terrible in real life. The crew found it and shot it as is without any set dressing for the scenes showing it run down and scary. The production worked out of cinematographer Dean Cundy's Winnebago parked nearby. It wasn't until the very last shot on the very last day of production that they had to transform the house. The opening scene, which was actually filmed last, shows the Myers house in 1963 when the family still lived there. For this shot, the entire crew banded together to paint the house and dress it with furniture to make it look lived in and normal. Everyone pitched in to make it happen. They installed temporary plumbing and electricity, put up wallpaper, and furnished the entire interior. After filming the opening sequence, they had to take everything out again. The house's real decrepit condition worked perfectly for most of the movie, saving the production significant money on set design. Today, the house doesn't exist anymore in its original location, but the Strode house at 1537 North Orange Grove Avenue in Hollywood is considered a civic landmark due to its cinematic history. The house was built in 1888, making it over 130 years old. Fact 13. After Halloween was completed, producer Irwin Yablans tried to get major studios to distribute it. He reached out to every studio in town and pulled in his old contacts at Warner Brothers to set up a preview screening, but nobody showed up. The major studios were completely uninterested in distributing horror films because they believed horrors never made any money. The genre was considered unfashionable and unmarketable. Rejected and frustrated, Yablans decided to distribute the film himself through his own company, Compass International. He soft-launched the movie in Kansas City, Missouri, a small market that closely resembled the Middle American setting of the film. He chose Kansas City strategically for 2 reasons. The setting would enhance the movie's resonance with audiences, and if the film flopped, Yablans could bury the loss and try his luck in a different market without the failure being widely known. Halloween premiered on October 24, 1978, in downtown Kansas City at the AMC Empire Theater. Instead of flopping, word of mouth spread like wildfire. The film became a hit and slowly expanded to more theaters. By the time it completed its theatrical run, Halloween had grossed $70 million worldwide. Every studio that had rejected the film watched in horror as an independent independent distributor, made a fortune. The film's success proved studios completely wrong about horror's profitability. Fact 14, John Carpenter and Deborah Hill originally titled their script The Babysitter Murders. Producer Irwin Yablans was finishing directing a TV movie when Yablans called him with a suggestion. Why don't we set it on Halloween night? In fact, why don't we call it Halloween? Carpenter loved the idea immediately. The original script had the events taking place over several days, but it was a budgetary decision to compress everything into one night. Having the action occur on a single day reduced the number of costume changes and locations required, which saved money. Carpenter and Hill wrote the final script in just 10 days. Hill, who had worked as a babysitter during her teenage years, wrote most of the female characters' dialogue. Carpenter drafted Dr. Loomis's speeches about the evil of Michael Myers. Many script details came from their own backgrounds. The fictional town of Haddonfield, Illinois, was derived from Haddonfield, New Jersey, where Hill was raised. Several street names were taken from Carpenter's hometown of Bowling Green, Kentucky. Laurie Strode was allegedly the name of one of Carpenter's old girlfriends. Michael Myers was named after a British producer who had previously helped Carpenter enter Assault on Precinct 13 in European film festivals. These personal touches made the script feel authentic and grounded despite its horror premise. Fact 15. In the original script, Dr. Loomis was supposed to look surprised when he discovers Michael Myers' body has disappeared from the lawn at the end of the film. But when it came time to shoot the scene, Donald Pleasance made a suggestion that completely changed the ending. He told John Carpenter that Loomis wouldn't be surprised by Michael disappearing. Loomis had spent 15 years studying Michael and knew exactly what kind of evil he was dealing with. His reaction should be more like he expected this to happen. Carpenter loved the idea and decided to film it both ways, once with Loomis looking shocked and once with the "I knew it would happen" expression. After seeing both takes, Carpenter used Pleasance's version. This subtle change transformed the ending from a simple shock moment into something much more chilling. It suggests that Loomis always understood Michael couldn't be stopped, only temporarily halted. The moment became one of horror cinema's most unsettling conclusions. It implies that Michael Myers is truly unstoppable and will keep coming back forever. Pleasance's instinct about the character showed his deep understanding of the role. Despite only working 5 days and appearing for 18 minutes, his contribution shaped the entire franchise. That ending set up the possibility of sequels and established Michael Myers as an eternal, unkillable force. Fact 16. Halloween was filmed in May 1978 and released in October 1978. That's an incredibly fast turnaround from production to theatrical release. The post-production work, including editing, sound mixing, and adding the score, was completed in just 5 months. This rapid pace was possible partly because the film was so low budget and didn't require extensive special effects work. John Carpenter wore multiple hats as director, co-writer, and composer, which streamlined the creative process. The editing was done by Tommy Lee Wallace and Charles Bornstein. Carpenter composed the entire score in 3 days, which further sped up the process. The film's simplicity actually worked in its favor, because it relied on suspense, atmosphere, and practical filmmaking rather than complicated effects. There was less to do in post-production. Modern films often take a year or more between filming and release, with months dedicated to CGI effects alone. Halloween proves that sometimes less is more. The quick turnaround also meant the film hit theaters at the perfect time for Halloween season. The timing couldn't have been better. Releasing a movie called Halloween right before the actual holiday was brilliant marketing. Audiences were primed for scary content, and the film's title alone drew curious viewers. That same year production to release schedule would be nearly impossible for a major film today. Fact 17. The famous stabbing sound effect that you hear throughout Halloween wasn't created with sophisticated audio equipment or expensive Foley work. The sound designers achieved the disturbing effect by literally stabbing a knife into a watermelon and recording the sound. The wet, squishy sound of a blade penetrating the fruit created the perfect audio representation of stabbing without being so realistic that it became unwatchable. This simple, low-budget solution became one of the film's most memorable audio elements. The technique of using everyday objects to create sound effects is common in filmmaking, but Halloween's stabbing sound became particularly iconic. Every time Michael Myers strikes with his knife, that watermelon stabbing sound reinforces the violence without showing explicit gore. Carpenter wanted the film to rely on suspense and suggestion rather than graphic violence. The sound effects do a lot of the heavy lifting, making the murders feel brutal without showing much actual bloodshed. In fact, Halloween contains very little blood compared to later slasher films. Most of the violence happens off-screen or is merely implied. The stabbing sound became so effective that it was reused and referenced in countless horror films that followed. That watermelon probably did more for horror cinema than any fruit has a right to. It's a perfect example of creative problem solving on a tight budget producing an iconic result. Fact 18. Many crew members on Halloween worked for minimal pay or even completely for free, just for the experience of being on a film set. Most were students or amateur filmmakers who heard about the production production through word of mouth. They willingly put in 12 to 14-hour days because they wanted the opportunity to work on a real movie and learn the craft. The production became legendary as essentially a bunch of film students making a movie. Everyone pitched in to help with whatever needed to be done. When they needed children for trick-or-treat scenes, crew members rounded up their own kids and dressed them in costumes. Robert Englund, who would later become famous as Freddy Krueger in A Nightmare on Elm Street, worked on Halloween for one day as a struggling actor. He spent the day scattering fake leaves on the California set to create the autumn look. Years later, he became a horror legend himself. The collaborative, all-hands-on-deck spirit of the production contributed to its success. Everyone believed in what they were making and wanted to be part of something special. John Carpenter later said that everyone on that set had something to prove, and they were all struggling to break into mainstream Hollywood. That hunger and determination shows in the final product. The crew's enthusiasm and willingness to work for almost nothing made the impossible possible on such a tiny budget. Fact 19. Halloween was incorrectly credited with creating the horror movie rule that only virgins can defeat the killer. This interpretation became so widespread that it influenced an entire generation of slasher films, but John Carpenter and Deborah Hill have repeatedly denied that this was their intention. Their actual reasoning was much simpler. The characters who die are so preoccupied with sex that they don't realize there's a killer loose. Laurie Strode survives because she isn't distracted by a boyfriend or sexual encounters, so she remains alert and aware of her surroundings. She's the only one paying attention to the danger. Film scholar Carol Clover later analyzed Halloween and coined the term final girl to describe the virginal female character who survives horror films. While Laurie does fit this pattern, Carpenter insists it wasn't a moral judgment. He and Hill simply wanted to show that being distracted could get you killed. Despite the creator's intentions, Halloween accidentally established a trope that became fundamental to the slasher genre. Countless later films, including Friday the 13th and A Nightmare on Elm Street, adopted the sex equals death formula. The pattern became so predictable that the Scream franchise satirized it. Halloween's influence on the horror genre extended far beyond what Carpenter and Hill intended. Sometimes a film's cultural impact transcends the creator's original vision and takes on a life of its own. Fact 20. John Carpenter was paid just $10,000 to write, direct, and compose the music for Halloween. That seems like a tiny payment for someone doing 3 major jobs on a film. But Carpenter was smart enough to negotiate for 10% of the film's profits instead of just taking a flat fee. At the time, $10,000 seemed like good money to Carpenter, who was unemployed and struggling. He later admitted he had no idea the film would become a massive hit. When Halloween grossed $70 million worldwide, Carpenter's 10% deal suddenly became life-changing. He later recalled in interviews, "I can't remember exactly how much money I made off the film, but I do remember getting one check for over $1 million. That wasn't bad." That single check represented 100 times his original $10,000 fee. The percentage deal meant Carpenter benefited enormously from the film's unexpected success. It set him up financially and established him as a bankable director. He went on to make classics like The Thing, Escape from New York, and The Fog. Producer Deborah Hill also had a percentage deal and made significant money. However, many others weren't so fortunate. Nick Castle earned only $25 per day. Jamie Lee Curtis received $8,000 flat with no profit participation. Donald Pleasance took $20,000 with no back-end deal. Halloween's success proves the importance of negotiating profit participation when you believe in a project. And there you have it, 20 weird and surprising facts about Halloween, the low-budget indie film that became one of the most influential horror movies ever made. From watermelon stabbings to reused fake leaves, this movie proves you don't need a huge budget to create something terrifying and timeless. Which fact surprised you the most? Let us know.